So today I want to talk about evictions and the problems in the methods that the US has used to provide eviction protections. Now, the CDC and the federal government have an eviction moratorium in place. However, that hasn't stopped landlords from attempting to, and often successfully, evicting people from their homes. And this has happened for two main reasons. One is that there is a number of legal loopholes that landlords can use, and the second is that in many cases, landlords have successfully ignored the law. And this provides a huge problem in our society right now. First and foremost, evicting people from their homes represents something that's difficult in any time. You know, a person losing their home and losing their way of life can be extremely difficult. And as someone who believes that housing is a right and should be a right, it's something that is really just unjustifiable to me. But even if you're someone who doesn't see it quite as a right, it's hard to argue with the fact that during a pandemic, evicting someone from their home actually represents a greater cost to the society. Now, the issue is that when you evict someone from their home, you end up in a case where either they are homeless or they end up moving into a more crowded space with friends or family. In either instance, there is an increase in the risk of spreading the coronavirus, and furthermore, that can lead to burdens on the medical system, the possibility of further mutations of the virus, and for the individuals involved, certainly long-term potential risks, including long-term health conditions and possibly death. And that's something that we should very much consider moving forward. And from the landlord's perspective on all this, it still confuses me because wouldn't you prefer to get partial payments from a tenant who's trying to work with you in good faith rather than trying to seek a new tenant during a pandemic when everyone is really financially struggling? It just doesn't seem to make much sense to me. It would make a lot more sense, in my opinion, for them to be working alongside their tenants to try to advocate for governmental reform to actually get proper funding in place to preserve the current dynamic that probably was working relatively well for the landlord, especially before the pandemic started. So, with that said, I want to talk about some of the problems with the way the eviction protections are implemented. And I want to start by going over one of the forms that is provided from the CDC and the federal government to try to provide protection for people. Now, this form is the Declaration under Penalty of Perjury for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention of Temporary Halt in Evictions to Prevent Further Spread of COVID-19. So this form, it says it expires on January 31st, but as far as I'm aware, the Biden administration has pushed that date back to March 31st, retroactive to all forms, so you don't have to fill out another one if you filled one out previously. And they're just using the current form. Now, this is the form that one has to sign in order to get federal protections if you want to prevent yourself from being evicted. And this ignores a number of different issues. And I want to go over some of the details here and just explain what my issues that I'm able to see are. First and foremost, you may also still be evicted for reasons other than not paying rent or making a housing payment. So basically, all this document is saying is that while you are in your current lease, you cannot be evicted for not making payments. Or even not, even though it does say in here that you have to make partial payments, which is complicated. But basically, if your lease terminates, you can still be evicted. There is no reason for the landlord to continue a lease with you. So if that landlord were to maybe find someone alternative to you by the end of your lease, they can freely evict you with no problem, which doesn't quite solve the problem of keeping people in their homes and protecting them, and creates a legal loophole, especially as we're getting close to a year, and most leases work within the span of a year. And most leases that I have seen or come across in my lifetime are usually done on 1 year terms, maybe even less than that, 6 months or monthly terms, where the landlord isn't really required to keep you in that space. And yes, they do have to give you a month's notice or other measures in order to remove you from your space. But that doesn't mean that you are not in some sort of situation where after that lease terminates, you can't just be removed from your home. So, going under this, you are basically pledging under penalty of perjury that the following statements are correct. I have used the best efforts to obtain all available government assistance for rent or housing. Now, like this form, that is kind of arbitrary because how much knowledge a person has about their legal rights is often based on a number of factors, which can boil down to, language spoken at home, to economic condition, to how many jobs a person's working, to education background, to time to research because maybe their kids need to be taken care of. There are so many reasons that one might not know that this form even exists and assume when they hear something like a federal moratorium that they're automatically protected. And so, what exactly constitutes this? What exactly constitutes best efforts? And that ends up being up to the landlord and a court to decide. And because the landlord can challenge this document at any time, and we'll get to that. But basically, what we're looking at is a document that seems kind of arbitrary. And again, you don't necessarily have all the knowledge going in. It's up to the people to find out the knowledge rather than the government just providing protections. And that's often an issue. So second, I either expect to earn no more than $99,000 in annual income for the calendar year 2020 to 2021, or no more than $198,000 in filing a joint tax return. Was not required to report any income in 2019 to the Internal Revenue Service, or received an economic impact payment, stimulus check, pursuant to Section 2201 of the CARES Act. Now, basically, this is just setting up the means testing, and I would really love to know what the exact reasons for these means testing are. This is not available on the document itself, and I couldn't find it specifically, but if anyone has it, I'd love to see it. The means testing involved here might work in some areas, might not work in others. I can definitely see the argument that $99,000 is a larger amount of income, but that doesn't preclude the fact that some people making that amount of money might not be living paycheck to paycheck given certain circumstances. So I don't know what all the details are involved with finding these means testing, but I just find means testing in general to be a poor measure of protecting people. And it often leaves cracks and legal loopholes for certain, fringe circumstances and situations. In this particular case, but in many cases, it ends up really harming and reducing certain people, and it creates stigma, which ultimately doesn't really help in this situation. Next is, I'm unable to pay my full rent or make a full housing payment due to substantial loss of household income, loss of compensatable hours or of work or wages, layoffs, or extraordinary out-of-pocket medical expenses. So they actually do define out-of-pocket medical expenses, which is basically any time that your medical expenses are likely to exceed 7.5% of one's adjusted gross income for the year. Now, if you're someone who lost their job and isn't making any money at all, that might work in your favor because technically speaking, any medical bill is of that amount. But if you're making certain amounts of money and maybe your pay got reduced or your hours got cut, that might make it so that even if you are choosing between rent and medicine, your medicine may still not be a valid consideration for that. And that creates a problem. Again, anytime you've got means testing of that sort where you're coming up with this arbitrary number of 7.5%, even if there's backing to it, it's always going to miss the mark at what you're trying to achieve. Furthermore, the other parts of this, that you have to prove that you lost household income or compensatable hours. I mean, that is probably reasonable given the government's position, although I think it's a poor test. But basically, just being able to show that you're not, just not paying your rent for no reason, even though sometimes there might be reasons that aren't so obvious. And I guess that's one that sort of makes sense within capitalism and the system that we're in. So I'm not going to fight that one too much on that regard. Using best benefits to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment as the individual circumstances may permit, taking into account other non-discretionary expenses. So this is where things get really messed up. It's one thing to say, oh, well, I'm not making as much money, so I can't pay my rent, and I'm having issues because I was clearly able to pay things before, but now I can't. It's another thing to determine how much of a partial payment should be determined. And to flat out say that, well, I'm trying my best when a lot of different factors could have come into play, including maybe having additional childcare because, I don't know, the school system shut down, or any other number of reasons that are just outside of the scope of my thinking right now. It's kind of difficult to figure out how much one might be dealing with in terms of these particular situations, and to determine how much a partial payment should be, how much that has to be, how much, you can't have savings, you can't save up for the next month's, medical expenses because you need to make a payment. If this gets challenged and brought to court, I just wonder what the standards are. Are they arbitrary based on the judge? Are they arbitrary based on the landlord's discretion? And, is it the person who gets to make that decision? It just seems to be one of these anomalous figures of try your best. But how do we determine one's best? And can a person therefore be evicted if they didn't theoretically try their best in the court's eyes? If a person's choosing between medicine and food and, paying partial payment of rent, and they decide to pay for their medical costs, but it's not an absolute necessary that they have that particular medicine for that particular month based on the court's determination, are they then subject to eviction? What are the standards here? And that's a really important question that I don't have the answers to, and I doubt a lot of people do as well. Next is if evicted, I would likely become homeless, need to move into a homeless shelter, or need to move into a new residence shared by other people who live in close quarters because I have no other available housing options. I mean, that one just kind of makes sense. I assume, according to this, available housing means any available unoccupied residential property or other space for occupancy in any seasonal or temporary housing that would not violate federal, state, or local occupancy standards, and that would not result in an overall increase of housing costs to you. So basically, could you afford to move into another space within your new limits and restrictions, without having to move into another space that is, controlled by another family member or something like that? And I guess that one under capitalism, again, is relatively reasonable, although I'm sure there's ways that can be found around that one as well. I understand that I still must pay rent or make a housing payment and comply with other obligations that I may have under my tenancy, lease agreement, or similar contract. I further understand that fees, penalties, or interest for not paying rent or making a housing payment on time, as required by my tenancy, lease agreement, or similar contract, may still be charged or collected. So all this is saying is you still got to pay your rent at the end of the day. The problem I'm having with this is that there's no real time limit on that. And if your economic situation changes, what are then the restrictions put in place? Say you actively made $99,000 in a new job that you just got during the pandemic. What is the time frame and what is the manner in which you are supposed to make these payments and, back pay your rent? Can a person then say, well, you're making $99,000 now. Can I get my, 8 months that have been owed to me? And if you say, well, no, I need a few months to get myself back on my feet and pay back my medical expenses and take care of things, can landlords still move for eviction? And keep in mind also that if you are evicted, it's going to make it less likely that other landlords are going to want to take you on as a renter, even if the eviction doesn't necessarily succeed. Just having that court order against you might be enough because that's public record. And so, this can create a larger problem. So you could end up doing everything right, actually get the job at the end of the day, and the landlord decides they arbitrarily want to evict you. And maybe that doesn't make much sense economically for them, but a lot of this doesn't make sense economically for people. So, leaving it to the discretion of a person who may not necessarily have their own best interest in mind doesn't really make sense to me. I further understand that at the end of the temporary halt on evictions on January 31st, and again, this date has been moved forward, as far as I'm aware, to March 31st, my housing provider may require payment in full for all payments not made prior to and during the temporary halt, and failure to pay and make me subject to eviction, pursuant to state and local laws. That one is the absolute worst, because that addresses part of the problem that I was dealing with before, where maybe your income situation changes, but it basically says at the end of the moratorium, you're owed all the money. The end. And that means there's room for eviction right at the end. Which means if we don't find a way to handle this economic side of the crisis at some point in the near future, we're going to end up in a place where a lot of people are going to lose their home just for the back payments, because that's going to be grounds for evictions. And again, if you're evicted, other people are not going to want to take you on as a tenant. And that's going to make a cycle of perpetual, poverty and issues, even if we get through the pandemic, even if we return to any sort of normalcy, which we need to do way better than normalcy involved. So, one of the solutions to all of this is to provide a blanket eviction ban. Now, in providing a blanket eviction ban, that would say that no matter where you are in your housing situation, you are not allowed to be forced to leave it. Unless, maybe some certain specific circumstances where you're actually causing major property damage to the house or housing complex. And even then, there might be a restriction put in place where you just get billed for all that. The idea of protecting people and keeping them in their homes is really important during the pandemic. Keeping people as distant as possible is definitely a benefit. And so that's one alternative that was put in place. In fact, I believe it was New York City that put that kind of restriction in place for a while. And you actually saw a flat out removal of evictions for a period of time. So, given all of that, the other situations that have occurred is when the landlords have flat out just violated the legality of documents like this one. So outside of all of that, and part of the issue is that most people facing eviction don't have a lawyer. So in addition to all of the problems that I mentioned within that document, and maybe not having access to full legal knowledge and knowing what forms you have to fill out, landlords overwhelmingly do have legal protections. And the other benefit of a blanket eviction, just to point that out, the blanket eviction ban, is that tenants wouldn't be responsible for having to know exactly what's going on. Implementing things that are automatically processed through tax returns and other things is probably more beneficial than people having to fill out forms to apply for them. Because you can't really have a situation where the tenant has to be responsible for everything, because getting the knowledge to people is often more difficult than just implementing the process in a clear across-the-board fashion. And again, having the legality in place where lawyers are not provided for tenants can create situations where, one, they can't back themselves up on these documents, but two, even in situations where the landlords are acting in complete bad faith and violating the law, tenants often don't have protections and have to defend themselves. So on paper, there are these stiff penalties for landlords who violate the order. But, up to $100,000 and even jail time according to this. But the problem is that there's been no enforcement. There's no consequences in practice. So if you have a law and nobody enforces it, what's really the effect of the law? And so, you have people making partial payments, but there's also this other legal loophole that's present. This one particular facility ended up saying that because somebody kept making partial payments, that they were actually not able to make further partial payments without paying the rest of their full month's rent. So basically, things compounded in a way that made it so that they weren't making proper partial payments, and it was economically interpreted that way, and payments were actually denied. So they were able to say, well, we got no payments, therefore. And having a lawyer to back that up can make situations difficult. And again, it's all of these legal loopholes. And when you have the law on your side and you have a lawyer on your side in particular, while the other side doesn't, it can make things difficult. Again, violations are rarely enforced, and emergency rental aid programs can actually require buy-ins from landlords. So if landlords won't sit down with you and actually fill out certain paperwork with you, sometimes you're not even able to buy into the rental aid programs. And this is what I was getting at when I said that that landlords need to work with their tenants, not work, against their tenants in terms of the pandemic and the structure. Appeal to the government, appeal for more benefit and aid, appeal to get your costs covered for that property. Don't appeal to the people who are literally struggling and can't pay their own way out in terms of food and medication. It just seems like the wrong group to target. You're not going to get your money back in the long run if you take that stance. And in many places, it's actually local protections that are making a bigger difference than the federal protections. And like I said before, New York City is one of the places where evictions actually plummeted to zero back in March last year, shortly after the coronavirus surfaced, and they put in their own protections. It was a 90-day ban on all eviction proceedings. And we need something like that federally across the board in order to actually protect people. Housing advocates want to see a universal moratorium, one that applies whether tenants know it exists or not. And that's kind of what I was getting at before. The idea that a tenant should not have to fill out a form and put themselves under perjury and have all of these issues in place where things can be subject to the court. Just put a thing in place that says evictions are banned, the end. And then start working and moving in directions where landlords, maybe especially the ones where that might be their only source of income, are forced to, get protections in place or any other number of reasons or ways the government could protect people. The point is to keep people in their homes. And if that means supplementing some of the landlord's income, do that. If that means protecting tenants, do it. Make things as easy as possible for people. People are already struggling. This is a mental health crisis. This is a physical health crisis. This is an economic crisis. Make things available for people. And it's unlikely that the federal government's going to do anything without being pushed. They need that pushing, and landlords might actually provide a good force for that. So, with that said, if renters can't get a lawyer, but the landlords can, the law is on their side. And there's also a power dynamic at play that really needs to be spoken about in this. Namely, if you are the person who owns the property, and you can control whether or not a person who hears the words, "I have an eviction moratorium, I am protected," is then told by the landlord, no, we're going to take away your housing. The landlord is at risk because they are potentially going to lose a source of income in all this. The person living in the home has to deal with the reality that they might lose their home. Now, that doesn't mean that the landlord isn't suffering from the loss of income. That doesn't mean they might not have their own economic problems. But at the end of the day, they still own that property. They could leverage that property. They could sell that property. They have property in their favor. They have capital in their favor. The person who's going to lose their home and the only place they've known and might be homeless and have kids who might be homeless or have to move into a shelter or might have to move into another person's home, that person is putting themselves at more risk. Way more risk. There's just a power dynamic, whether it be the legal side of things or just the circumstances of a landlord controlling property. And that can create a very scary situation. And so we should be moving in the direction of trying to get the law to make things as easy as possible for tenants, especially right now, to preserve them in their homes, because the pandemic is no joke and people need to stop being evicted. So with that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter. Check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.